and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Iran International Insight. My name is Gelareh Hon. I'm a news anchor at Iran International and I'm honored and privileged to moderate tonight's discussion. We met at a pivotal moment. Recent reporting from Iran, as Aaron mentioned, points to an unprecedented wave of uprising across the country in the history of Islamic Republic of Iran, and equally an unprecedented response from the state. Tens of thousands have been reported killed, arrested, and many whose fate remains unknown. Today, we move beyond the headlines, and we dive deeper and examine the triggers, the drivers, the regime resilience, the opposition dynamic, and future scenarios. If you have any questions during the session, please write down your questions. At the end of the session, we open the floor, and we are going to have a Q&A session. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. To my immediate left, Bozorgmehr Sharafedin. Bozorg is a head of digital at Iran International. Before joining the network, he spent 8 years at Reuters, covering Iran's nuclear negotiations, sanctions, and global energy market. Mohamad Machine-Chian is a senior journalist here at Iran International and former senior researcher at University of Pittsburgh Center for Governance and Markets, with nearly 2 decades analyzing Iran's political economy. Dr. Mohammad Ghaedi is a political scientist specializing in Middle East politics with a focus on Iran. His research explores how political psychology, identity, and narrative shapes conflict and diplomacy. Welcome to you, gentlemen. Bozorg, let's begin with you and the fundamentals. What happened in Iran? What were the triggers and the drivers, and why the regime was unable to contain and manage the protest before it escalated to nationwide protests?
Thanks, Gelareh. I think after 12-day war, we were expecting some form of uprising or mass demonstration. The question was what would trigger it? Another foreign invasion, death of Khamenei. Analysts were discussing the point of trigger, that what would trigger the next uprising. And I think the Iranian society surprised us all. And I think there are some underlying conditions like a falling economy, let's say oppression, corruption, environmental crises. We know that, but what would trigger a nation to come to the streets? I think analysts for long have focused on mega triggers, what I would call mega triggers. They are very interested in triggers that are big and predictable. Like many predicted that people will come to the streets after the death of the supreme leader. And that was the mega trigger that everybody expected. Everybody starts counting his age and his health condition. And many were thinking, oh, no, Israel will attack again. And they were expecting that to be the mega trigger. But what I want to point here is that Iranian society has moved beyond mega triggers because they don't work. We saw during the 12-day war, people didn't come to the streets as expected. And I think the same will apply. If the supreme leader dies, I don't think we will see any mass uprising because mega triggers are centralized, they're predictable, and that's why they're easier for the government to contain. They can control the timing, they can control the narrative, that's why it's much easier for them to contain it. And if you look at the history of Iranian uprisings and demonstrations in the last 2 decades, we see the Iranian society has wisely moved from demonstrations triggered by mega triggers to minor triggers. So, for example, we had the Green Movement, which was the trigger after an election. And then we had the demonstration in 2019 as a result of a gasoline price hike. If you go before that, you see a lot of demonstrations in 1999, for example, the student uprising was the result of the shutdown of the biggest reformist newspaper. So, but if you look in recent years, we see that the triggers are very minor, like the death of a woman in police custody, or in this case, the strike of a very small section of Bazaar. So minor triggers are very difficult for the government to contain because they're not centralized, they're unpredictable, and they're emotionally charged. So I think that was one of the reasons that many people were surprised that why it started from there. And if you look at the, for example, Arab uprising history, it started from self-immolation of a street vendor in Tunisia. So I think Iranian society has wisely realized that I think the trigger doesn't matter. You shouldn't wait for the big events to happen to come to the streets. Any small trigger can be fatal. And I think this has created a lot of anxiety in Iranian security forces in the sense that any death, any strike, any incident, any minor incident can be the last incident in the Islamic Republic.
Thank you, Dr. Machine-Chian. Bozorg mentioned mega triggers. One of these mega triggers might be economy aspect. And in your recent analysis, you've argued that while the protests are economic on the surface, they represent a deeper rejection of Khomeinism itself. Could you elaborate? What do you mean by that?
Absolutely. But first, to Bozorg's point, I think I completely agree. And I think a contributing factor was that the regime has gotten much better in managing, in countering, in planning ahead for mega triggers. And maybe smaller triggers are all that Iranians are left with. But to your point, to your question, I should say, it is true that I'm not trying to take anything away. It is a reality. The suffering of Iranian people, the economic condition is real. Just to draw you a very rough picture of what is going on at the moment, the inflation is nearly 60%. American people experienced 10-12% inflation after COVID. You probably remember the impact of a 12% inflation on your life and on your dinner table. Iran has been suffering from at least 22% inflation in the past 20 years. In the past 5 years, the inflation has been, the average is around 40%. In the past 2 years, it has reached 50%. In 2025, it reached 60%. This is average inflation. The inflation of food, basic necessities, is about 72%. If we go deeper, it gets uglier. The inflation of cooking oil, 210%. Red meat, 112, 115%. This is the reality that people are dealing with. However, it is worth, I think, pointing out that the ideology of Khomeinism begins, the whole prescription, the whole worldview begins by demanding abandonment of material life. So any and every Iranian citizen is expected to sacrifice the material life and their lives even for a greater good. And greater good is whatever the Ayatollah deems fit, the party line, basically. So demanding a normal life, and Iranian people are, as the most Iranian thing you can do is to compose a poem. Iranian people are composing poems about having a normal material life. They are demanding to be able to have a normal material life, to have choices, to be able to. This is, in and of itself, is a rejection, I submit, of Khomeinism itself. The whole ideology of the Islamic Republic. People couldn't be any more clear about that. And this is a theme I think tonight I would get back to time and again, because this is essential. It is pivotal to understand how the Iranian society thinks these days and what they're looking for.
Dr. Ghaedi, I would like to take your assessment on that. And also, if we can call it a battleground, let's move to the other side of the battleground and kind of examine the regime's response. How do you assess the regime's response, the unprecedented brutality from the regime?
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank Iran International for putting this amazing event together, specifically for our students and audience here. It's amazing. Also, I agree with Bozorgmehr's typology of triggers. This is a really, really great analytical tool for scholars. So there are several factors playing a role here. One of them was any mass protest in authoritarian regimes, such as Iran, is perceived and interpreted as existential threat. So according to the calculus of the leadership in Iran, a forceful and rapid repression can deter further escalation and also elite fragmentation. So according to their calculation, maybe this was better than, maybe appearing weak was worse than international and internal responses to their reaction. But there are several root causes that is playing a role here. In the last round of protests, they played a huge role, and in the future, they also play a huge role. One of them was, as you mentioned, economic pressure, a result of mismanagement, corruption, and also sanctions. So internal and external forces, they played a role. Also, social control was very important here, specifically when women and youth, they have modern identity perceptions and expectations. They're dealing with a lot of social control in Iran. This was another factor. And also social and political exclusion of minorities, a lot of different groups. This was another factor. But I think on top of everything is the legitimacy crisis and gap in Iran. And the leadership of Iran is pretty aware and mindful of this legitimacy gap. Think about this. In democracies, when we ask people, why should the leaders rule over the society? The answer is because they are elected by the nation, and the nation can vote them out. President Trump or other leaders in democracy, they can vote it out. But if you ask the same question from Iranians, they wouldn't have a clear answer, because 47 years ago, Ayatollah Khomeini deceived the nation, made some empty promises in Paris before revolution, that when I come to Iran, there is no ruling of the clerics, and I'll go and live in Qom. So he made a lot of promises about democracy, about human rights, women's rights, and things like that. But he solidified over the course of time his power and monopolized power. They excluded other groups, a lot of nationalists, a lot of seculars, a lot of leftists and communists who played a role during the revolution in Iran, and they even changed the constitution. And the new constitution with changes about the guardianship of the faqih or the Islamic jurists doesn't make any sense to the population. The population, through more further communication with the rise of social media, are now mindful of this theory of velayat faqih, and they don't want it. The majority of Iranians, they don't want to be ruled by someone who cannot get elected by the nation and cannot get voted out, and is making a lot of bad, horrible decisions for Iran. So the leadership is aware of the lack of legitimacy within the government institutions, so they have to give such a response that the nation is not willing to protest again. I think that explains the brutality of this repression.
Yes, You talk about the legitimacy gap. Bozorg, let me bring this back to you. After this level of repression and distrust, is recovery even possible for the regime?
I don't think so, for the exact reason that Mr. Ghaedi said about the legitimacy crisis that we see in the Islamic Republic. The way I see it, like I think Iran's situation revolves around three factors. I would say the supreme leader, Khamenei, people, and Trump. Let's imagine it as a triangle. There are other factors like Israel, the Revolutionary Guard, Pahlavi, but I think they are subcategories of these three, Khamenei, Trump, and people. The relationship between Khamenei and people, the social contract between the two has expired. That's why there hasn't been any referendum in the last 45 years in the Islamic Republic. And Khamenei tries to recreate that, like by calling on people to come to anniversary of the revolution, to bring people on the streets. But we see people are not participating in those ceremonies, in elections and stuff. So that part of the equation doesn't work anymore. So what the possible scenario? So we know the coalition between people and the supreme leader won't happen. That is expired. So there are only two more scenarios here. Either the supreme leader will come to a deal with Trump at the expense of people. That is something that Iranian society is very worried about at the moment. That they might find a nuclear deal and that would solidify power in the Islamic Republic. That is one possible scenario. The other scenario is that if Trump sides with people against the Islamic Republic, that is what keeps Khamenei awake at night. So if you look at this equation, again, it doesn't mean that the Islamic Republic will come out of the crisis, because Khamenei, in both scenarios, Khamenei will be the loser. Because either Khamenei needs to make a deal by his enemy, or he should see a foreign invasion in his country. So he will be the loser in both.
Which scenario is more possible?
I think that's very difficult. I think at this stage, I think the likelihood of a military intervention is quite high. But at the same time, what we hear from Geneva, we see that the Islamic Republic might come to compromises that it hasn't done before. But I think in this equation, Trump will be the winner either case. You know, it's just either he come to a deal with the Islamic Republic that's with compromises that never existed in any deal, or if he chooses the military option, I think he will be the only winner. So I think this is the equation. Like Khamenei is at the weakest position at this stage in a nuclear negotiations, and the United States is at the strongest position.
Yeah, you want to add?
May I, if I may? This is interesting because this was the, I think, the summary of what the both of us were talking about. So I said people want choice. Dr. Ghaedi mentioned that they don't want a guardian. And this is interesting. It comes together. So the Ayatollah has no answer. Basically, has nothing to sell to people that people want, basically. I think this is the root cause of the legitimacy crisis, isn't it?
Exactly.
Dr. Machine-Chian, we keep talking about the people. And we know that when we talk about the people, we also talk about institutions. And in your recent piece, you've argued that you've called bazaar and mosque as pillars of the regime. Where do they stand now? Is the relationship between the regime, bazaar, and mosque as its main pillars have shifted? And if so, where is it going?
I would go a step further. I would say that mosque and bazaar have been main institutions or very essential institutions to the Iranian society. Historically speaking, these are the main institutions of any Muslim majority society from the early days of Islam. And even in our contemporary history, they served very important functions. And of course, they had a very interconnected relationship. So Bozorg funded the mosque. In doing so, influenced, checked, tempered the rulings of the Ayatollahs. This deeply frustrated Ayatollah Khomeini at the time. He was at the time, going back 50 years, 60 years, he was one of the biggest critics of this dynamic. He, along with other ideologues who contributed to the Islamic Republic, including Ali Shariati and the likes. After the revolution, after he seized power, he severed this historic connection between mosque and Bozorg. He started funding mosques, religious institutions, from the public budget. And of course, they had a very deep coffer at the time. We're talking about $110 a barrel oil and billions of dollars in reserves. And the astronomical budgets of the religious institutions ever since became a friction point between mosque and Iranian people. Over time, of course, Bozorg became subordinate to a centrally planned economy of the Islamic Republic. All the decisions are made in an office building in Tehran, and it is planned, and Bozorg's historic role in the Iranian society eroded over time. The mosque, they militarized. Khomeini believed wholeheartedly, he used to talk about it very regularly, that we should mobilize mosques. At the time, of course, millions of Iranians frequently went to the mosque. I remember the generation of my grandfather, they would go to mosque every day. My father's generation, my mother's generation, they saw it differently. They changed the attitude. By the time that I was of age, and until right now, going to mosque, especially if a young person regularly goes to a mosque, there's a stigma, there's a negative connotation because you don't go to mosque to pray. You're going for political networking, rent seeking. You're seeking an office because they're card holders, literally. We have almost 50,000 Basij bases in mosques. This is well documented that mosques now have detention centers, they have armories. The Basij members, and Basij is the militia under the IRGC, the Islamic Republic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So over time, they militarized mosques, basically. Mosques lost their function, their social function. And in every protest in recent times, mosques have been used as for detention centers and for sniper hideouts, of course, which happened again this time. This time, it was astonishing. An IRGC commander on national television called to Basij members to gather in mosques and fight the enemies. And the enemies, by the way, the enemies of the state in Iran are called enemies of God. And state has used every tool in their arsenal to act as representatives of God. As it happens, however, let me get to the conclusion. In Islamist movements, in political Islam in Iran, religion has subsumed by politics, by the ruling interpretation, again, of the Ayatollah. And we used to have a diversity of interpretations, of course. No longer the case. As the result, I think this round of protest was very significant because it started with Bozorg finally completely breaking with the Islamic Republic. They had a hand, they funded partly, of course, Bozorg, if we want to go deeper, even at the time, 50 years ago, 47 years ago, it was fractured between the industrialists and the conservative traditional, but nonetheless, part of Bozorg funded Ayatollah Khomeini and the movement. No longer the case. And these institutions, the Islamic Republic stood on these two institutions and now has lost both of them. And from now on, especially, yes, they can build more mosques. Effectively, they can build more armories and barracks in the neighborhood. and they will have a function in repressing ordinary people, but they will no longer they will serve any social, civil purpose in the Iranian society. And the bazaar is no longer with the regime. Yeah. This fundamental change, I think, will impact the future of Iran. I have absolutely no doubt of that.
So we've been talking about the major shift in Iran, the evolvement and identity changes of institutions in Iran, and how that create a new ideology and new needs and wants from people of Iran. So shifting gears and to widen the lens to current crisis, I want to bring this discussion to the opposition dynamic. Nearly for about 5 decades, the Islamic Republic of Iran tried to delegitimize and erase the identity and legacy of Pahlavi. And now he's the most recognizable first of opposition, people chanting his name from inside Iran and outside Iran. How do you see the rise of Reza Pahlavi? What happened?
Wow. So this is such an interesting question and topic for scholars in political psychology, because it's about narrative political psychology and two different things. One of them is Iranians, they weave carpet. Meaning that they are very patient. It takes a lot of patience to weave a carpet over the course of time. And Iranians, they have tried all chances for reform from the within in the past. Khatami in 1998, Mousavi in 2008. But all of these efforts, they failed because the supreme leader doesn't want to reform the system from the within. Now people have moved to different actors for their leadership. And so the rise of Pahlavi shows that people want a structural change, not just reform from within the system. So the second thing is about the narrative and the rising narratives in Iran. As a students post-revolution, we all remember, at least the four of us, from the textbooks that the Pahlavi family was very, according to the textbooks, was very corrupt, repressive and oppressive. So now students in Iran, different generations, they're getting faced with similar narratives, but in reality they see that the Islamic Republic is really, really tyrannical, corrupt, repressive, and oppressive. And when they think about history, the images that comes first to mind is Iran was modernizing fast in the 60s and 70s. The Gini index was lower during Pahlavi ruling of Iran. So maybe there was some elements of not a democratic regime during Pahlavi, but he said that I heard your voices of revolution and I'm ready to make changes. So at least at the time during Pahlavi, there was not such a strong or any social control that women and the youth are facing in Iran now. All of these factors, they are playing a role in making Pahlavi, Shahzadeh Pahlavi, more popular among a lot of Iranians.
Agree?
I do agree, of course, but I would think, I think it goes even deeper. I think Khomeini tried to forge a new identity for Iranian people. He despised, as he confesses to it, he despised the Iranian identity. He has spoken against it on a few occasions. And he tried to replace it with the Islamic identity. And of course, Islam has always been a part of the Iranian identity. But for an Iranian identity to be a Muslim or a Jew, a Christian, or a Zoroastrian, you're Iranian nonetheless, you're equally Iranian. Khomeini tried to took the Islamic part, tried to dominate the rest, to make it all about Islam. And he tried to destroy, basically to erase the Iranian identity and everything that came with it. The history, the culture, rites and rituals, even the shared relationship, for example. So we have the oldest bond with Israel. This has always been the case. And all of this frustrated him. 40-some years later, I think there is a reawakening happening before our eyes. And along with the rejection of the Islamic identity and the dead end of the mosques no longer serving any function, all of this, I think, comes together. Young people, young Iranians are discovering the Iranian identity again. And this Iranian identity has institutions, symbols attached to it. The institution of monarchy has been around for 7,000 years and has a very long history, a lot of traditions, much rituals, of course, attached to it. And Crown Prince Shahzadeh, as you mentioned, we call him, is the symbol, is the person representing this institution. I think that's all this comes down to, I think.
At the point, I think I agree with those. I think there's another factor happening here as well, that if you look at the history of Iranian uprising in the last 10 years or so, it started with leaders inside the country. In the Green Movement in 2009, it had leaders inside the country, and the Islamic Republic contained it quite easily. He put them under house arrest for 10, 15 years. Then the uprisings evolved into leaderless shape. So that's why we see in 2017, 18, the uprising was leaderless, and that was very difficult to contain. But I think in this round, we see the leaders of the movement the Iranians have decided to go to leaders outside Iran. So I think the epicenter has moved from inside the country to outside the country, and that has become very difficult for the Islamic Republic to contain it. And I think a leader is a very powerful tool. Like, he calls on demonstration. Millions of people come to the streets inside the country. The demonstrations last Saturday outside the country were the biggest demonstrations. Altogether, if you put together London, Toronto, Munich, and LA, these four cities, 1 million Iranians came to the streets. So that is the power of having a leader who calls on a date and a demonstration. So I think that is also a part of this evolution.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I want to add something. I totally agree with Mr. Machine-Chian that in a nutshell, we can debate a lot of aspects of the ruling of the Shah pre-revolution. But I have no doubt that he totally loved Iran, and Khomeini didn't. And a lot of people perceive that the current leaders of Iran, they don't love Iran, and they are not prioritizing Iranians. And when it comes to supporting proxies, a lot of people are, this is a perception, a common perception, that even they brought proxies in to repress the people of Iran.
I'm not sure if you want to talk about this, but we had a private conversation, and you raised a very interesting point, because I have encountered this question that maybe it's a new thing, maybe we have no experience with a leader outside the country. But this is not the case, is it?
No. I think in Iran, in the last century or so, has had two revolutions, the constitutional revolution and the 1979 revolution. Both of them managed and led from outside the country. Khomeini was in France and in Iraq. And if you look at the constitutional revolution, part of it was happening inside the country, but there were a lot of thinkers, intellectuals, journalists outside the country. They were inspired by ideas and concepts in London, in Istanbul, in Kafkas, and in Egypt. They started publishing newspapers, so they formed ideas of rule of law, equality, all those things were injected into constitutional revolution by people from outside the country. So yeah, I think this might be the third one.
So another hot topics and headline these days is U.S. Intervention with the current crisis in Iran. But before I ask the question, I want to let you know after this set of questions, we would like to open the floor. We appreciate the engagement. If you have a question, please write it down and prepare your questions. With that being said, I was going to ask you, Dr. Ghaedi, here at Iran International, we receive thousands of email, videos, and voices from people inside Iran requesting support from outside, from the West, to support the movement. And they believe we are at the critical moment and this momentum needs the support, Western support. How do you see that? How did people get to that point that you mentioned Iranians love their country? What is happening? How did they get to this point?
We have a really good theory for this in political science. It's about frustration. And frustration over the course of time, and there is no hope for change. So people now, instead of their organizations, a structural reform is not possible within the system, now they are asking for help from outside actors, such as the United States. And we can talk about maybe whether which type of help could really make changes to Iranian maybe future. One thing is during Mao and Stalin in Soviet Union and in China, change was not possible. So a lot of Iranians today are talking about the change of leadership. And if you talk to Iranians, and I'm talking to a lot of them, if there is any targeted strikes for the change of the leadership in Iran, a lot of Iranians wouldn't cry for the current supreme leader of Iran if he's eliminated. So, but I know the complexities and the nuances, the external, internal forces on President Trump, a lot of push and pull. So I know the complexities of that type of decisions and operations. But I think targeted sanctions on repression actors can be useful tools. Also, access to internet and information for Iranians, and also multilateral humanitarian help for Iranian. Both the US and allies helping Iranians in terms of human rights. These are some types of the assistance that can really help Iranians at the moment.
Dr. Machine-Chian, your take?
I think we've exhausted everything else. I think at some point, each and every one of us was against any form of military intervention. But when you see the human lives, the cost in human lives, when you see that people desperately doing anything and everything in their power to change their situation, the current situation, I think there's nothing else left, at least for Iranian people. And any other scenario imaginable, there's a great deal of human lives, again, will be lost in every other scenario. It's even difficult for me to talk about other scenarios, to be honest with you. This is all we've left with, I think.
We talked about it before. At some point, Iranian people were happy to get to some sort of negotiation table, and they were rooting for JCPOA agreement. But today, it seems like the landscape has changed a lot.
Yeah, if you look at the change in the psyche of the Iranian society in the last few decades, is unbelievable. Like, this was the nation. Recently I had to watch the footages from the funeral of Khomeini. And the footage is unbelievable. It's the biggest funeral on earth. Like I think it broke the records. And people are going for this, for his body. They're taking the shroud to have this sacred shroud, and they're struggling to put their body on it in the ground. At the end, they bury Khomeini, and they bring 3 containers put on top of the grave so people don't exhume the grave. Because many people died in the funeral, the stampede. I mean, if you look at the videos, it was like people were mourning as if a nation has lost its father. But now people on the street are saying that they hope that the new leader dies. You know, this change of psyche. And let me tell you, foreign intervention was the biggest taboo in Iranian psyche, the biggest. Because we had the occupation of Anglo-Russian occupation in 1940s. And after that, one of the main pillars of the Islamic Republic, Islamic Revolution, and what Khomeini was promoting was independence. And he was saying that Shah is the puppet of the US and Israel, we want to be independent. And then we had 8 years of war with Iraq. Many Iranians, hundreds of thousands went and died to defend Iran's independence. So this change of psyche is very interesting, that how now, if you look at the discussions inside the Iranian society, there's a lot of discussions that Americans came and helped the French during the World War II, and many other examples that they are arguing that there is nothing, this is not against independence if we seek foreign help. So I think this change of psyche is very interesting that is happening in the Iranian society.
Any point you want to add? So we would like to open the floor for Q&A. If you have any questions from our panelists, please feel free to ask your questions. Please go ahead.
I'm in Dr. Ghaedi's 2 classes in the GW, and I have a question while you guys were talking about foreign intervention. So how should U.S. policymakers balance human rights advocacy with strategic interests when responding to these internal uprisings in Iran? So how do they balance their own, interest and the human rights part of it? Thank you. Open to the floor. Thank you.
Me?
Yes.
So it's a very intricate balance. I know it. So we've discussed a lot in our classes about foreign policy, its goals in the United States. In general, we have 4 Ps, 4 words that they start with P. Peace, principles. Human rights is one of the American principles. We talk about power and also about prosperity. It's a really difficult decision for President Trump to balance prosperity here, because we are talking about any change in the price of oil if there is a strike, because Iranians, they claim that they can target some of the oil reserves in the region. So this is one aspect. Also, it's about power, because if the U.S. maybe makes some changes in the region, maybe it has some historical results for both the region, the Iranians, and the U.S.-Iran relationship. So you can see pull and push. Some of the aspects of U.S. foreign policy, like power, can be consistent with human rights. Some of them maybe about the price of oil, and maybe some other aspects they are not necessarily. But I think at the end of the day, in several societies, including Germany, Japan, South Korea, these are examples that maybe a change of leadership can, at the end of the day, help both human rights in those societies and also the strategic goals of the United States.
And can I add another P really quickly? So proxies are a big thing right now. What are the proxies doing amidst weakened regime? I just want to forward that.
You mean the Iranian proxies?
Yeah.
I think, so that was Iran's defense strategy, that you try to build a lot of proxies to protect you when it comes to a day like this. Iran invested a lot of money in proxies, and you know, it came from that ideology that it's an Islamic state, yeah. So it's not a relationship between a ruler and its citizens, yeah, as you see in any other society. The money that the supreme leader has can be distributed among proxies, which are not Iranians, to protect this Islamic State that I would say that they believe that it accidentally ended up in Iran. It could have been anywhere else. So there is no loyalty between the ruler and the Iranians. So that was how the whole the ruling system and the whole empire was built. And we know that in the last couple of years, Israel has demolished a lot of Iranian proxies, like including Hezbollah in Lebanon and Houthis. So it's a kind of a defenseless state at this stage. And it's when you invest the money, instead of investing it inside the country, so Iranians help you to be your backers, you invest the money outside the country and you lose them all. And now that's why I say the Islamic Republic is very defenseless from both outside and within.
If I may just add a small point here, that is, proxies, the ideologue leadership has been decimated and no longer is in place. And the remainder are basically mercenaries. And that is why you see that just in 2025, during all the hardship that the Islamic Republic was enduring, they sent $1 billion just to Hezbollah to keep the salaries going. Without the money, because on the ground, I've been to Lebanon many times, and they're widely hated basically by their own people. It's not a good, it's just a good business. And without the money, there's no proxies.
I want to add something. There are several proxies in Syria. Iran has lost its proxies in Syria. Hezbollah and in Lebanon, things have changed a lot, and the Iranian proxy has been weakened a lot. Hamas, we know about Hamas now. It's been weakened, and the supply route between Iran and Hamas through the Rafah border has been cut. So there is no physical relationship between the two parts. Regarding Yemen, Houthis are a little bit different, but the most important aspect, I think, is in Iraq. Now in Iraq, Iran's proxy is still strong. 140-ish seats out of 329 seats in Iraq's parliament belongs to pro-Iran parties and groups. So they're still playing a role. Nouri al-Maliki is pretty close to Iran. He was running Iraq between 2006 and 2014, and a lot of problems in Iraq was caused by Nouri al-Maliki and his policies. Specifically, the exclusion of a lot of Sunnis and other groups in Iraq. But he's still a pretty strong player in Iraqi's government and parliament. There are narratives that Iran used the Iraqi proxies, bringing them in for repressing Iranians in the last round of repression. So in general, the perception of Iranians and their feelings about Iran's proxy in Iraq is very negative, but they still have some sort of support from the Iran's state.
Just a minor point. Somebody calculated Iranian government can't distribute free milk at schools. It says that we don't have budget for that. And somebody calculated that 1 year salary of Lebanese Hezbollah can be 17 years of free milk for all Iranian children at all schools, at all levels. So that's the problem that Iranians are quite angry with.
Good afternoon, I'm Lorenzo. I'm also part of Professor Mohammed's class. I actually have a specific question. Mohamad Machine, you mentioned the inflation hikes of the past few decades, and I was wondering if there's any correlation to the price of oil in the region, and if so, how is the oil stabilizing or destabilizing the same inflation rates that you mentioned that keep hiking in the region of Iran?
Of course, Bozorg is the oil expert here, though, but you want to go? Please go ahead. Well, in recent years especially, the sanctions have been added on top of the oil prices. So thanks to sanction, the whole oil dynamic and the oil revenues have changed significantly. So as a result, long story short, a higher margin goes to the sanctions merchants. That's what we call them, basically. And a lower profit margin goes to the public budget. So regardless of what the oil is, additionally, also, if you want to sell Iranian oil, you have to, include high discounts, basically, and mostly to Chinese teapot refineries. So even at times that oil is like $7 a barrel, there's a very small margin ending up in the public budget, and that is after a long delay. Especially, this also played a role in the recent, in the past couple of months, at least, if I remember correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, $8 billion from the 2025 oil revenues never came back. So there are other, I think, contributing factors than oil price itself.
Totally. 50% of the money doesn't come back. So because they sell with discount, as you said, and then there are other actors. So, some say, but despite sanctions, Iran is selling 2 million barrels per day, but it is selling as a very low price, and the money doesn't come back. So when the money, for example, it sells it to China, and Chinese construction firms come and build roads in Iran, for example. That's how they do. So the money doesn't come back. So that is the part. And the oil ministry has a lot of, the government has a lot of debt to the Revolutionary Guards, to the police, to the pension funds, and it gives them oil. So you go and sell it on the global market. So it's such a messy system at the moment. So you might see some tankers going there, ship to ship, or it might look like they are selling oil and the money is coming to the budget, but it's not that.
My name's Sabrina Sofer, and I'm at the Jerusalem Center on Security and Foreign Affairs. And my question has to do with the role of Turkey, Syria, and the relationship with the U.S. So if the U.S. strikes, how do you foresee Turkey and Syria responding, and in turn the U.S.? And I guess I'm coming at it from the context of Turkey wanting to sort of fill Iran's power vacuum, and Iran under a Pahlavi government or otherwise would be an ally of America and Israel, foreseeably. So do you foresee a split in U.S. policy, given that some officials in the U.S. government have been favorable toward Turkey and Syria, one of them being Ambassador Barak, and Trump's favorable stance toward Israel that we've seen thus far? So I'm just curious how you envision that all panning out.
I'll address the first aspect of the question about Turkey. So Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister of Turkey, several times, he has mentioned in interviews that he opposes any military confrontation between the United States and Iran, and we can understand the reasons. One of the reasons is related to Kurds, because he doesn't want to basically Iranian Kurds to maybe under a different situation, they become more powerful and stronger. And they're located on the west of Iran. So the second concern of Turkey might be Iranian refugees. They've been dealing with the Syrian refugees for several years, and they don't want to have a similar problem with the Iranian refugees. And I think the biggest concern for Turkey is currently Iran is balancing to some extent Israel. But if the Iran's government is weakened, or maybe under a different situation, under a different regime, the alliance between the new regime in Iran and Israel would change a lot of dynamics in the region. For those reasons, Turkey is opposing any military confrontation with Iran, and they have been advocating for this. So we know that before 12-day war, Turkish Prime Minister, he called Iranians to let them know that he has some sources, some American sources, that maybe a military confrontation or military attacks are imminent. And Iranians didn't pay attention to his signals. So what I mean is that Turkey is concerned about the military confrontation and is one of the sources of pressure on President Trump. And as I mentioned, this is one of the external sources for pressuring President Trump for further diplomacy and focusing on one agenda in the negotiations, and just the nuclear program, not the missile program or human rights.
Points?
Hi, I'm Celeste Marcus. I'm the executive editor of Liberty's Journal. Thank you so much for this panel. It was extremely edifying. I have a question about the point that I think everybody on the panel made, which is that these uprisings are not the result of a major trigger, that the Iranian people don't have the luxury of waiting for such a trigger. But it seems to me that this is a little bit in tension with the analysis that this uprising is coming at a time when Khomeini is extremely weakened. And that is the product of the erosion of his position globally because of the weakening of all of the proxies. And we've talked about the 12-day war several times, but of course this started after October 7th when Hamas overplayed its hand dramatically, and then Hezbollah and the Houthis did the same thing. And what I'm asking is a broader question about the intention or the intuition of these uprisings, because it does seem to me, and maybe this is wrong, that global leaders like Netanyahu and Trump have an interest in the overthrow of this regime for reasons that are entirely distinct from the reason that the people are in the streets. And there was a lot of talk as soon as it was clear how harsh the crackdown was on the protesters, that this could be, especially amongst analysts in Washington and Jerusalem, that this could be the end of the regime. And there isn't a clear connection to me, and I hope that you will speak to this, between what any strikes could do for the people. Because even if this particular leader was overthrown, I don't see how that leads to regime change in the country. And I'm curious to know if there are leaders, you mentioned Reza, maybe that's the hope that he would be, but if there are leaders either in Iran or outside who are strategizing about the day after that we don't know about.
Let me just begin briefly about the intentions and intuition of Iranian people. I think it evolved over time. Going back, I remember early days when I was younger, we went to streets demanding something very different. Over time, it changed. At some point, we were demanding our votes to be counted. Over time, we were asking for our civil rights. We were asking for, sometimes we wanted a better economic conditions. This time, and I think this goes to answer, at least goes to the mentality of the regime, why they reacted the way they reacted. Because this time, it started in Bazaar. It was about economic situation. When ordinary people joined the movement, started to address the effect, it started to address the cause instead of the effect on the economy. People started challenging the core values of the Islamic Republic. People demanded fundamental change. People's demand no longer were feasible or even possible within the framework of the Islamic Republic. We ended up here.
If I may add a quick point, I think the reason the Islamic Republic reacted so harshly against the protesters was that it saw an existential threat. And the existential threat was clear because of the size of demonstrations inside the country, which was unprecedented. It was Trump who tweeted a few days before that we are lock and loaded, we are ready to come. So it was the first time the Islamic Republic had to fight in two fronts, inside and outside the country. And Khamenei wanted to wrap it up very fast. So I think he knew that the time is against him, and that's why he unleashed maximum violence and brutality to wrap it up in the limited time. If you look at the previous protests, it usually took weeks to finish, but this one ended in 2 days. So instead of controlling the crowd, the Islamic Republic decided to rule by fear, and as I said, ended fast. And I think what is happening, in my opinion, that is interesting is that Trump is trying to use the same two tools that Khamenei used against the nation against him. He's ruling with fear. Now look at all the military buildup around him. Khamenei wants to buy time. Trump is not a person who gives them time. He said, no, you need to commit to this limited time. If not, we will go to the next phase.
So you mentioned the link between external strikes, military strikes, and regime change. And this is a really important question. I think the equation is very complex. It has a lot of aspects. But the most important aspect are really two things. One of them is the leadership. The second thing is the security apparatus, the repression forces, and their willingness and capability of repressing future rounds of protest. So I specifically mentioned the change of leadership, and I quoted a lot of Iranian friends on that. It's not my personal position, because they believe that maybe under a different leadership, maybe negotiated transitions is more likely compared to today. We see in South Africa in the 90s, we have a different leadership in South Africa, both. In the opposition, we have Nelson Mandela getting released, and also in the government, we had a different leadership, and they negotiated. Maybe under a different leadership, the negotiation is possible, but I don't think, I agree with you, I don't think that there is a direct link between strikes and change of regime. It's very complex. It depends on a lot of factors. Whether people take to the streets or they get unified, I think that people would take the streets of Tehran, but then the question is, can they really take over the institutions of the government? What's the government response? What type of repression the government wants to use? What type of tools after they, for instance, let's say they take over one of them buildings of the government, okay? So it's very complex, but the change of leadership specifically can make some changes to the decisions that the current leadership is making regarding the protests now.
That concludes our session. Thank you to our panelists for thoughtful conversation, and thank you to our audience for your insight and your engagement. You have a wonderful evening.